Welcome to Paranormal Northwest, a podcast all about the history and the paranormal of the Pacific Northwest. Join me as I tell stories of this great region, the history, the people who live here, and those who may have never left. So you might hear some background noise this episode. I am recording during a thunder and rainstorm, which I absolutely love. I'm sitting here drinking a hot cup of tea, and my cat is also mad at me because I locked him in the bathroom because he was being very loud and rambunctious when I was trying to record this episode. So any cat noises or wind howling noises are real. As far as I know, they're not ghost noises. Today we are traveling north of the United States border to Victoria, British Columbia in Canada. Yes, British Columbia is part of the Pacific Northwest and an important part of Pacific Northwest history. And today we are visiting the Langham Court Theater. Let's start with the history of Victoria, British Columbia. Victoria, British Columbia is located on the southern tip of Vancouver Island, off the west coast of Canada. The city of Victoria was named after Queen Victoria of Great Britain, and settlement in what became the city began in 1843. Today, Victoria is the capital of British Columbia. Prior to European exploration, Vancouver Island was home to the Coast Salish people. The Coast Salish people are the indigenous people from the mouth of the Columbia River in Oregon to the Butte Inlet in British Columbia. Within this group, there are an estimated 56,000 members still living in the Pacific Northwest today. Most Coast Salish groups live near rivers and inlets, with fishing a primary aspect in their lives. Fishing and all that goes into it, the water, the tools, the ceremony, are a huge part of the lifestyles of the Coast Salish people. The Coast Salish group that lived in present-day Victoria was the Songhees people. Beginning in the 1770s, British and Spanish explorers began to enter the area, although where Victoria sits today was actually not explored by European explorers until 1790. During the first part of the 1800s, the British had established their presence in the region, although farther south along the Columbia River. Remember the whole Fort Vancouver thing from episode 1? With the imminent threat of a stronger United States presence in the region, the British were encouraged, or perhaps even enticed, to have a stronghold farther north. In 1841, Fort Victoria was established on the present-day site of the city of Victoria. The fort itself was built in 1843, and although it was originally named Fort Albert, it was renamed to Fort Victoria. The Songhees built a village across the harbor from the fort. Images drawn at the time show the Songhees village was just an imposing structure as the fort. The official Crown Colony was established in 1849. Over the next 6 years, treaties were made with the indigenous people to purchase their land in exchange for goods. With this acquisition of land, a town was laid out that became the capital of the colony. In 1858, gold was discovered on the British Columbia mainland. This caused the Port of Victoria to become a gateway for those traveling up the west coast, seeking their fortunes in the Fraser Valley. In 1862, Victoria was incorporated into a city. This was also the same year that a smallpox outbreak ravaged the population, especially the First Nations people. An estimated 2/3 of the First Nations population in British Columbia died due to the illness. The city of Victoria continued to grow in the latter part of the 19th century. The city was an integral part of the controversial opium trade until it was banned in 1907. Victoria's prominence in British Columbia diminished when the railroad was connected to Vancouver on the mainland. But Victoria has continued to grow steadily over the last century and a half, becoming a cultural center of British Columbia. It is also one of the most beautiful cities I personally have ever been to, and although I have not been all over the world, I have been up and down the west coast of the United States and around the Pacific Northwest, and in my opinion, Victoria is probably the most beautiful city in the Pacific Northwest. So if you ever have the opportunity, I definitely suggest you visit. Motion sickness is not your friend if you choose to ride the ferry, but pretty much one of the few ways to get to Victoria and the fastest way to get there from Seattle. So in Victoria, there's many cultural centers, and it actually has quite the population of theaters. So we are visiting the Langham Court Theater. And most of the information that I did receive on the history of the theater, I actually got from the theater's website, and I will try to link that on my website as well. So the original buildings of what would become the Langham Court Theater were built in 1876. These buildings consisted of a carriage house and barn that were home to the Robert Ward family. I couldn't find any information about Robert Ward or his family or why he would build the house, unfortunately, but we do know that it was originally their family home. In 1903, the home was bought by the Collegiate School for Boys. The school's original building had been destroyed in a fire, so the home was a replacement school. Initially, the carriage house was converted into classrooms as the Ward family still lived in the main house. When the family moved out, the carriage house was converted into a gymnasium and an assembly hall. Classes were then held in the main house. In 1912, the buildings were purchased by the St. George's School for Girls. Per the 1918 Handbook of Private Schools, Volume 4, St. George's School for Girls is a day and boarding school accommodating about 100 girls. The course of instruction prepares for high school examinations and McGill matriculation, the art department being emphasized. The girls' school did not need the use of a gymnasium, because girls aren't active, right? And turned the carriage house back into classrooms. The new owner subdivided the property in 1924. The school closed around 1928. This could have been due to the economic climate or that the owner of the time wanted to use the buildings as something that was more profitable. The building, which was now named the Laurels, became a lodging house in August of 1929. The burgeoning theater scene in Victoria comprised a few local theater groups, leading to where the Langham Court Theater is today. In the early 1930s, the Victoria Operatic Society leased the old assembly hall behind the Laurels for their headquarters, as well as a rehearsal space. The carriage house was rented out as a meeting place and a rehearsal space to a few different theater groups during this time. In 1936, the owner defaulted on the loan, allowing members of the theater groups to then purchase the property. Starting in 1938, the buildings on the property underwent massive renovations. The goal was to make the space an effective theater for the community. Some of these renovations included a furnace was installed under the south end of the building. Apparently, the space between the building and the ground was so small, people had to crouch beneath the floor, passing buckets back and forth for the construction. A stage was constructed with an orchestra pit in front of it and tunnels that led to the dressing rooms. Wings were added to the sides of the stage at a height of 35 feet. An auditorium floor was ramped. Theater seats were added, which were actually obtained from another Victoria theater. The barn was converted into an area for set making with another tunnel that connected it to the theater. When the theater officially opened on September 20th, 1940, the Daily Colonist commented, quote, "The organization now has one of the most comfortable and complete little theaters in Canada," end quote. Between 1940 and the summer of 1950, the theater was named the Little Theater. It was not until the summer of 1950 that it was renamed the Langham Court Theater. During the 1950s, the theater underwent more construction. The barn was again renovated, and the barn and main building were connected via a tunnel. This tunnel was used to store set pieces, as well as a walkway between the two buildings. During this time period, the theater itself also saw changes. The orchestra pit was covered over as the practice of using a live orchestra died out. This allowed the stage to be extended, allowing the actors to be closer to the audience. Many renovations continued over the next 40 years, with some minor redecorating and even some major renovations, such as completely tearing out the theater and excavating the space beneath it for storage in 1992. And through it all, the show still ran. That's the great thing about live theater. The show must go on, even if there is an extra guest. If you Google Haunted British Columbia, Langham Court Theater will almost always appear on any list that pops up. It is known as one of the most haunted places in British Columbia. But I couldn't find any stories. The lists that did note something were all the same thing. The Langham Court Theater is haunted by the spirit of a young girl. She is reportedly seen in the audience during shows and even seen backstage. There are two theories as to when she is from. Either she is a former student from the time the location was a girls' school, or she was a young girl who worked in the stables. Either way, I was unable to find any first-hand accounts of her. So, if you have ever been to the Langham Court Theater in British Columbia and witnessed paranormal activity, please let me know. I want to hear the stories. But this has got me thinking, what is it about theaters that cause them to be beacons of paranormal activity? As a theater kid myself growing up, I spent plenty of time in theaters. From the audience, they seem almost seamless, with everything in its place, working in perfect harmony. However, behind the scenes, theater is chaos in the best possible way. The wings of the stage are flooded with people and props. The dressing rooms are almost always a disaster. During a production, there is rarely a moment of stillness or silence. And yet, for many people, it is always calm, always comforting. For myself, theater was, and still is, a way for me to step outside of myself, a way to let go of whatever is troubling me, and embrace a character or a moment. I have always felt comforted and cared for in a theater, even when alone. Perhaps that is why so many theaters around the world are supposedly haunted. Those who felt that same peace I have always just happened to stay. I know this is a podcast all about the Pacific Northwest, but I wanted to share a little bit about some of the most haunted theaters in the world, and I can do that because I wrote the script. First, let's travel to New York City, the home of Broadway, an icon in itself. The New Amsterdam Theater was built in 1903 and lies at the southern end of Times Square. This theater was home to the Ziegfeld Follies, who embodied the art of theater meets vaudeville in the early 20th century. One of these follies was a young woman named Olive Thomas, who moved to New York in 1911. Olive earned the title of the most beautiful girl in New York City and became a member of the Ziegfeld Follies. Sadly, Olive died in 1920 at the age of 25. She is still seen at the theater to this day, although almost exclusively by men, dressed to the nines in her Follies outfit. Next up is the Palace Theater, also in New York City. The Palace Theater was built in 1913 and is one of the largest theaters in the city. Like the New Amsterdam Theater, the Palace Theater was the home to vaudeville acts until the 1930s. Supposedly, nearly 100 different spirits are said to haunt the Palace Theater, with the most famous of which might be the spirit of Judy Garland. Moving across the Atlantic, which is truly weird to say in this context, let's travel to London, England. The draw of the West End is the same as that of Broadway, and in my personal opinion, even more intriguing. With theaters older than the United States, London has to have some great ghost stories in those theaters. The Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, is the longest continually running theater site in London. The original theater was built at the site in 1663. That theater sadly burnt down in 1671, but a larger theater was built on the same spot. That theater was demolished in the late 1700s, with another new building being built. That also burnt down in 1909. The current theater building was built in 1812. Hopefully, they made that one out of stone. With such a long history, there are numerous ghosts that supposedly haunt the Theatre Royal, the most famous being the Man in Grey. He appears to be a nobleman of the late 1700s, with a powdered wig and tricorn hat. Legend says he may be the spirit of a man whose remains were found walled up in the building in 1848. There are also specters of previous actors dating all the way back to 1735. All of these specters are a sign of good luck for the actors and their productions. Also in London, the Lyceum Theatre was built in 1765. From 1816 to 1831, it was used as the English Opera House. However, that building burnt down, and a new building was built on the site, opening in 1841. Be careful with matches in London. In 1931, the building was set to be demolished, but was saved. In 1996, the building was restored and has been the home to the West End production of The Lion King since 1999. Supposedly in the 1880s, during a production, a couple looked down from the balcony and saw a severed head sitting in a woman's lap. The head is rumored to have belonged to a member of the family who originally owned the land, who was beheaded for treason. I'm pretty sure I could do a huge deep dive on haunted or supposedly haunted theaters. But for now, I, for one, am not quite sure where the Langham Court Theater falls on that list. So thank you so much for listening to this episode. Next time, we're headed back to Washington State and taking a look at the Northern State Mental Hospital. Please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at ParaNWPod. Until next time, bye.